This is a topic I've been working on for quite some time, and it's about 2,000 years history. It's been going on for some time. Every time I'm adding new things, I hope it won't take me 2,000 years to finish the project. I'm learning all the time. So this is really a big topic, an old topic. I'm hoping to do something new. This topic has been there for a long time, but has been made much more prominent recently by Walter Schada's book, Escape from Rome, which has been a very popular book. Is the fact that Europe was fragmented, is the fragmentation given Europe the kind of dynamism, and China has been unified for a long, long time, and the unity itself was quite a bit of a mystery. So, there's the idea that escape from Rome. Actually, for Europe, it was very lucky for them to have escaped from the Roman Empire. In China, the case, well, Beijing wasn't particularly the old capital, but certainly it remained a centralized empire for a long time. So one of the consequences of this, of course, you can see that there's probably 1 billion Europeans and descendants that spread over different continents and several different countries, including getting to the New World and so on. Whereas China, 1 billion people basically remained in one continent, one state, and speaking one language and so on. Sometimes, this is John King Feldbank's Cambridge History of China book, called this the onus of unity, the burden of unity. So let me get into this. So this is the very standard way of some people saying because Europe was fragmented, so there's competition within, which allowed innovation to take place, where China, if it's good, it's good. If it's bad, everything just goes bad, right? So this is a very good example of very little diversification that's coming out of it. So for Special Professor Chen, the finance person, so China as a case was very little risk of diversification, right? Okay, I want to go through this quickly because I'm hoping to convince you that we are doing something new. This is joint work with Chen Suo at Fudan University, who are a graduate from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I remember I was his examiner of his dissertation. So the project actually started back then, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 years ago. So it's still shorter than 2,000 years. So this is a stylized picture that China was relatively unified, where Europe remained very, very fragmented. I will have a lot more data. So there has been no shortage of hypotheses. Okay, there's been some really recent work, both empirical work as well as historical work. And some of the empirical work recently I will show later on, published in top journals, trying to explain why China was unified. So a lot of people have been talking about what was the consequence of Chinese unity, right? Part of the outcome is stagnation. And there's also a piece of prosperity coming out of it. Well, we are proposing something here that's very, very ambitious. Maybe it's both economists, historians speaking at the same time with mixed voices. And it may be too ambitious. To tell me if that is too ambitious to a certain degree. And we try to hopefully correct what we think is oversimplification, oversimplified explanation by relying on, for example, geography alone. So we are making what we call tripartite hypothesis, and some of them can be tested, and some of them cannot be tested, but at least they can be quantified. Is the reason China remained unified certainly had to do with geography, which I'll talk about a little bit. But also one of the things, the geography itself was an ideological construct, and with certain institutions that evolved. I will tell you what these institutions, geography, ideology were. And all of that is working through the main channel. That's the channel we can actually test econometrically, is the warfare, particularly agrarian nomadic warfare. So, and very important that these three things work together. So what we are seeing here is not, as a lot of economists trying to identify the causal link and so on. We are here arguing things are co-evolving. There's causal link, but a lot of it is co-evolution. Okay. So there's a layout of the mechanism. That's what we were trying to say. I will show you what the geography is. And then first of all, when you have warfare, try to unify, which leads to, in the case of China, we know that very well, is resource mobilization lead to political centralization. In particular in China, that's one important institution is direct administrative rule. In Chinese, the 军宪制, right? And with 军宪制 come with the 科举制度, the civil service examination. So all these things develop fairly early on. And with that comes with actually private property rights, so small holding peasantry, and all of these things that come together. So that's the set of institutions that come together. This is what we talk about agrarian China. And one of the big problems, I will get to the geography, is this agrarian China stop in the nomadic frontier, which is roughly defined by the Great Wall. Okay. Once the combination, eventually unification came through the agrarian nomadic synthesis, okay, or sometimes there's also cultural identity that comes in. And in particular, that will lead to a merging of these two forces, and that merging leads to an expansion of cultural identity, which is in particular the idea of the Hua-Yi and the Chinese and barbarians. So as you can see, what we emphasize here is that it's not just geography, the ideology had to adapt to really accommodate or create a new form of legitimacy. So as I would tell you a little bit, we will put together 2,000 years of data. In particular, this time, the thing that we have added new, talking with my co-author, is we are able to use the textual analysis to begin to extract the word frequency. So in some sense, we are not able to test econometrically the role of ideology, but we are able to quantify, to show the idea of unity is very, very occupy a very central place. We use the HKIHSS 24 historical annals to really construct the word frequency of certain keywords. And we collected warfare data. Now those data have been collected for a long time, but we have different ways of sorting them out. Okay, one of the things we want to argue is the idea of a single unified China. In Chinese, everybody knows the words called 大一统, right? That idea came very, very early. They come in the Chengqiu Zhanguo, the spring and autumn period. And there's the idea of everything all in one family under the heaven. Okay, that particular idea was very, very important. And also there is a geographical, maybe sometimes imagined space. This is Jiuzhou, right? The 9 different states. Okay, and with the Chinese were the center Hua and the barbarians. I will show you a picture of exactly describing this. I want to argue that this is a geographic concept, but this is also ideological construct. So this is what distinguishes from some other studies that use geography only. But that, of course, concept is very, very tricky. Now, you can see that particular concept is China's in the middle, the Hua-Yi, right? And there's 4 barbarians on 4 sides. So it's a cosmological concept to a certain degree. And this is the English translation. You will see, I think later on, the archaeology will show that much more clearly. One of the things when I would say talk about environmental circumscription. So this is a fairly closed space, and the reason China remained unified more easily than the Roman Empire, because it was at the edge of the Eurasian Empire. There's Pacific Ocean, so that's blocked. There's Himalaya, that's blocked on the west. Right? The south, there's very, very little challenge of political forces. The only big challenge is coming from north. And that's where the nomads were, semi-nomads were. That's where the Great Wall was built, okay? So there is the idea of distinction between Chinese and the barbarians. So this is something that will come back again. Now I want to emphasize the ideologies begin to adapt, constantly changing the idea of barbarian Chinese. This particularly become a very important issue when it comes to the last dynasty, by Qing dynasty, which itself is supposedly a barbarian idea. Okay, so geography matters here. This is the blue area is the agrarian region. And the other areas are nomadic or semi-nomadic. That's why the agrarian system was very hard to be enforced there. You know, the agrarian system has to come to with bureaucracy, with taxation, with all these things, and private property rights. But outside the Great Wall, also these areas that are very, very difficult. Okay, so Chinese system was not able to expand and control these areas. Eventually, it was the nomads that come into China and took over them. So we start very quickly. This is for people who know history very early on, but all we did is we quantified them, is the idea of the grand unity, 大一统, came in the feudal age, right? 封建体系. It's actually connected with the Confucian ideology. And then unity, we all know, was achieved under the Qing dynasty. And then one of the key ingredients of success of the Zhongxianzi is direct administrative rule rather than 分制度, rather than the delegation. So this is something very important. And the ideology people began to talk about the Confucians was the ideology, but the actual substance of Chinese rule is 法家, is the legalist rule. Okay, that's something very important. Legalist rule emphasize on, and this is what Qing Hui was talking about. I think Zhao Dingxing is using the term Confucian legalist synthesis. Okay, this is this number of states in the warring states. You know, you can see the warfare was going, and then eventually all the states collapse into one, and that's fairly well known. We know that. Okay, so I need to find the original Chinese version of this. One of the things I want to emphasize, when Qing unified, Qingtao unified China, the unification itself became the legitimacy of the state. That's very, very important, right? They're able to acknowledge 6 kingdoms, and remember the 4 barbarians, 4 categories of barbarians are 4 sides, that you really establish the legitimacy of a Chinese rule and restore peace for all under the heaven. Okay, this is something that legitimacy that came out again and again later on. So this is the first time we are able to a certain degree, not able to completely test it, but we are able to do at least some quantification, is to use the words of tongyi, unified. Okay? So we use the 24 historical annals. The last one stopped it, as you know, Qing dynasty is the last dynasty. There was no, the 24 historical annal did not include Qing dynasty, so it stopped at Ming dynasty. This is all the frequency of the word, the percentage of the word tongyi, unified. And you can see that occupied a very central place. Most interesting is in the Song dynasty, it certainly rose very high. So there's a very, very, in the paper we describe how we extracted that particular set of data. But one thing that's quite clear, the idea of unification remained a central place in Chinese ideology. Now, we want to, this is about sometimes like 0.1% to 0.3% in the total number of 24 historical annals. How important they are? So we actually look at the word zhengzai, which is another important element of Chinese legitimacy, right? That's about 0.13. I mean, this is 1,000%, right? And also compare with others, the Huangdi and Confucian. I mean, these are very, very common terms. And the idea of unification remained very, very strong. So that gives some kind of magnitude how important this is. Okay. So the next step was we began to test them. Okay, we look at states. One of the things, remember we use, this is the Qing 1820 map. So this is a much larger Chinese territory. I mean, for us, we are not saying this should be the right territory or wrong territory, but we're only interested in the idea of the nomadic and agrarian frontier that both are included. So the square parts are the capitals of different dynasties, and the triangle is the capital of different dynasties by the nomadic regimes. So that allows to actually calculate the number of nomadic and agrarian regimes throughout Chinese history to get an idea of unification and fragmentation. And so the blue ones, the number of agrarian regimes. So one of the things that's really quite important, any regime established a capital inside the Great Wall is considered agrarian regime. So, for example, the Manchu-Mongol dynasty, when they set up a capital outside, they're considered nomadic regimes. But once they move in, they're considered agrarian regimes. We will other ways to play around with the concept using ethnicity. Here, we're only using the institutional concept. Once they move into inside capital, they begin to use agrarian means of controlling, of ruling, which is bureaucracy, civil service examination, all of that. But you can see very clearly over time there are about 3 phases unification, 2 phases fragmentation. So China was not always unified. That's very, very important. It's not like China was from the very beginning could have been unified. And I think when I was giving a talk, Ge Zheshun was the one that made that point. China was more fragmented than unified throughout history, which almost landed him in trouble and so on. Right? But clearly, certainly by the 13th century, China was becoming more and more unified and eventually collapsed basically into one particular, we know that's the Qing Empire, Ming Empire, and so on, okay? The usual explanation, which we also incorporate, why China to a certain degree is unified, and this is something I got from Zhao Dingxin's book, and that's actually quite interesting. So one of the reasons why the unification to a certain degree was unified by a state on the west, right? So the Qing was very much a half nomadic, very close, and the center of Chinese civilization was sort of here. That's where the actual Henan provinces and all of that. So these states were fighting, but it was eventually a state from the west that was unifying everything. And that, to some degree, is quite easy to understand, as you will see that the unification coming from the west, because it was on the edge. So where all these states were fighting on all sides, they only need to fight on one side. And of course, again, we know the Qing dynasty was in the center of the Guanzhong Pingyuan, right? So this is something that's very, very crucial. And then you have the nomadic threat. So eventually, this is the geography argument that will really come in. So you can see that there is an overall Eurasian steppe That's where the massive different kind of nomadic empires really come in that put a lot of pressure on, particularly on China. So you can see Europe was far away from the pressure. So these have given a lot of pressure towards a unified empire. The agrarian empire was under this pressure. So this is one reason we see that, first of all, Xi'an was the place that eventually unified. Secondly, most of the unification coming from northern China rather than coming from the south, because that's where most of the threat was coming from. Okay, that's where the warfare was really coming into play. That was very important. There's a lot of material, partly because there's a lot more new research. This is coming from a recent work by Koyama and Duanhui and other people. One argument, for example, in terms of geography is that Europe was mountainous and China had these long rivers that linked together. But it turned out China actually was much more mountainous than Europe. A lot of people didn't realize how mountainous, how hilly China was. And in the times, for example, the entire Sichuan Pendi, right, was very difficult to get into. That's why it remained independent for a long time. People didn't realize, for example, Shanxi province was a very natural place for setting up as a kingdom, and that's exactly what happened in Chinese history. So it's not naturally true that Chinese geography was particularly favorable to unification. Certainly not in terms of the mountainous areas. Their argument, which is consistent with what we are doing, so the only thing was that paper, this is a paper that just came out in the QJE recently, using entirely simulation and arguing the reason China was unified, not because of the mountains and everything, the reason China was they have a very flat northern Chinese plain that allowed, particularly the Qing dynasty, control. Once you go from the Guanzhong and you go to the northern Chinese plain, you had a very large state. And that large state began to dominate, and once the Grand Canal was built, you get into the Lower Yangtze. So these two large plains allow China to basically have these agricultural surplus and everything to build up a very large state. And this is where the argument was mainly coming from. The control was coming from the north. Now we are not, we are showing that was the process, because in China the original state was quite small. Actually, it was focused on here, but over time it slowly, gradually expand. So the expansion had to come with ideological change, which we will show. So this is something that we enjoy doing, is that because of that expansion, so the Chinese capital was shifting slowly towards the east. This is, I believe, the longitude of agrarian capitals. So this Beijing became a capital much more later, and that was partly because they tried to control the northern Chinese plain, and then they began to fight with the Mongols and the Ming setting up a capital in Beijing. And of course the Qing, that became really, really quite permanent later on, okay? So we could do that for the latitude as well. You can see the Chinese was moving slowly towards the north. So there was slow movement towards east and north to control much larger areas of the geographic space. You can see the so-called China itself was expanding. When you're expanding, how do you deal with the much larger number of different kinds of people? In particular, we'll talk about nomadic people. That's where I think I will talk about the ideology will really come in. So this is actually the latitude for nomadic capitals, which don't show any change. In the nomads were fighting a little bit later on towards the west. That's, but we are interested in agrarian capitals. So this is another way of basically describing, remember, any regime is considered agrarian once they move inside the Great Wall. But if we are showing, even if they move inside Great Wall, we use ethnicity as a criteria, defining them as nomadic regimes. For example, Qing, once they move into Beijing, we still consider them as a nomadic regime. You can see that there's two phases of conversion, right? This is all the nomadic regimes that went inside the Great Wall and set up dynasties. So there's basic two phases. This phase is particularly, this is where the early Weijing, Nanbei Cao, all the things that happened. That's where Buddhism was coming in and a lot of that. So this is the second phase where the Song dynasty, the Liao and Qing, that was really coming in. So they was quieting down a little bit, but you can see that this is where the identity was becoming an issue. How do you deal with that particular identity? And this is quite well known. For example, the Song dynasty, which is becoming increasingly smaller, right? And especially Southern Song. But if you read history books, the Song dynasty was always considered the grand, Yue Fei and all these things, right? And the reason was because that was considered authentically Han Chinese dynasty, okay? That had always had a kind of legitimacy. And we were over lunch talking about how Ming dynasty had a kind of legitimacy of being Han Chinese dynasty, right? The Manchus, the Qing did not get recognized for a long time. Even the the Koreans, the Japanese did not have much respect for the Manchu dynasty. The Ming rebels ran to Korea and all these things. So this other thing we were trying to do, and I will show you a little bit later on, is we use, again, word extraction to show that Han Chinese and the different barbarians, Man Yi Long Di, right? And these are the word frequency that were there, and you can see they were very, very frequent throughout. We didn't do any econometric tests because the way these word frequency were measured were not, I don't think they were useful for econometric tests, but what it shows you is that this is really, really consistent. The idea of Han, the Hua Yi, that distinction had always been there, and the Yi concept of Yi was actually shifting, right? So this is very important. By mid-19th century, these so-called barbarians are the Western imperialists. So this is how we really define them. And that's really, really important, okay? But let me give you a little bit of narrative. I think for some of you who know that's one of the people who read our paper, gave comments about the idea of, especially the new Qing history. So you can see this is the Ming dynasty. This is Qing has vastly expanded, right? There's a long debate about what is the nature of the Qing regime. Is it really a Chinese dynasty? Han Chinese dynasty, as you have thought about it, and this is now becoming somewhat a controversial topic. Again, for people who know history very well, you don't need me to explain that, but there's the most interesting debate is between Yongzheng Emperor, and I think one of the prisoner, I think Zheng Jing, right? And the Da Yi Jue Mi Lu. And this is, of course, quite amusing that the emperor is having a debate with his prisoner. So I wonder how much a debate that is. That person was basically captured in prison, and the emperor is trying to persuade him that I'm right. But one thing that's important is that this particular Zheng Jing was trying to talk to the offspring of Yue Fei, right? And to have him rebel against the Qing, because he said, the Qing dynasty was not authentically Han Chinese dynasty, and it turned out the offspring of Yue Fei turned around against him, and so got him imprisoned, and then he had a conversation with it. And one of the things the Yongzheng Emperor was arguing is, today Qing was much bigger. Yes, we come from northeastern China, because of that, calling us barbarians, that's not fair, because even Confucius themselves may be coming from a barbarian area today. Sun, the most, Zhou Wenwang, they are coming from an area that were not originally the core Chinese civilizations, okay? The area, for example, like the Middle Yangtze, was really considered barbarian areas, okay? So this is Yongzheng's defense, that we are just as good as any Chinese rulers. And of course, Qing was probably one of the smartest. I think the new Qing history, they talk about 4 identities of the Qing rulers, right? They are Chinese emperors, they are the protectors of the Tibetan religion, Uyghurs, and the Mongols, right? So they really play these 4 identities very well, but to the Chinese, they are very well versed in the Chinese. But one of the things that's very important is the argument by Yongzheng, right? Is, look, we are so much bigger than before. This should be the greatest blessing for the Chinese people, okay? We got territories far beyond any of the Song, any of the Ming, or they have done before. So the Qing began to justify legitimacy, not just for being Chinese rulers, but also we are much bigger. So the size became a really big issue. So there's a lot of, and we know that's very well. The Qing began to also use, the Qianlong is very well known for using the censorship to control the whole dialogue about any mention of Qing as barbarians will be prohibited strictly, right? And the Siku Quanshu was compiled in a way that any of these discussions was completely purged. So you can see there's a massive 18th century propaganda control that, in a very, very large scale, okay? In the paper, we actually talk about the idea of the Qing being the authentic ruler became so deeply entrenched that the most famous is the Taiping Rebellion, and it was suppressed by Zheng Guofan and Li Hongzhang. And those are Han Chinese, bureaucrats who actually suppressed to defend the Qing regime. That shows that they really think that was really the authentic rulers. Okay, so I want to show you that this ideology part was quite important, that they were able to, when the empire was expanding, they were able to also change the rhetoric in order to justify the empire. Okay, so let me run through the data we have. And the warfare data is we differentiate into 3 types of warfare. One is the warfare fought between the agrarian regimes and nomadic regimes. And the other is civil wars, which is warfare fought between 2 agrarian regimes, for like the Sanguoyenyi, right? The 3 kingdoms, they are fought all between agrarian regimes and so on. And then there's rebellions. Rebellions are fought by a regime without a capital. So Taiping rebellion was considered rebellion. However, once they established a capital in Nanjing, they fought against the Qing. That becomes civil war. So it's a shifting. I will explain to you why we specifically divide into these 3 types of warfare. Our argument is very simple. Eventually, it's the agrarian nomadic warfare that remained constant. When the empire is unified, civil war slowly was disappearing. Okay, the only thing that's happening is rebellions. That was there, which was very, episodic. So we have these warfare data now defined in these 3 types. This is agrarian nomadic warfare. You can see that's the blue part. This is the civil war. And this is the rebellions. The rebellions sometimes just shot up very, very quickly, and then they just drop down. Okay, and you can see the agrarian nomadic warfare. So this is much better. This is a 100-year average. So agrarian nomadic warfare was about 70-80% of the total warfare all the time. Okay, so this particular pressure coming from the north was the unifying force. And because these regimes were considered barbarian, that's very important, right? That served the force to unify China. So I think you've heard of the 讲就是攘外必须安内, 外内. Those things are very, very important. As soon as you identify external enemy, and that's very, very important to use that as a way of promoting internal cohesion. So that was the external warfare that was always there, that you could see the civil war that was rising and fall, and the civil war was slowly disappearing because China was becoming more unified. Okay, you have very little civil wars afterward. This is something, we didn't play a lot in this one, but in the other cases that in Europe it's mostly civil wars, much more organized warfare. In China, in the end, either you have agrarian nomadic warfare, they're all rebellions, which are not very well organized, okay? Secret society, religious, all these things. And the civil war was slowly disappearing after the Song dynasty, okay? Which, of course, had all kinds of implications. And this is the data we show most of the war were fought along this particular area, the agrarian nomadic warfare. I will just show you the result of this. The agrarian nomadic warfare led to the reduction of the number of states, led to the increase in the size of states, and this we can test econometrically, use autoregressive distributed lag model. So these are the different variables that we have. These are the warfare and size of agrarian regimes. So we can see this is the average size of states throughout the time. For example, this is the Mongol dynasty, right? That's the largest size. This is the Qing dynasty, so we use the Qing dynasty size. Over time, China as a state, the average size of the state was getting bigger. Before, there were multiple states, right? Each state was smaller and they were getting also bigger. This is the same as the number of states to some degree. So this is the result we're going to say. So the dependent variable size of agrarian regimes, the number of agrarian regimes, you could see the agrarian nomadic warfare is the only variable that's significant. That is end up increasing the size of agrarian regimes, making unification more likely, okay? Reducing the number of agrarian states, which means that fewer states are able to survive because of the agrarian nomadic warfare. The other warfare is less significant, okay? So that is one result that we come up. I mean, I'm not gonna go into great details. We actually tested some causality showing it's not the other way around. It is the warfare causing the unification, sometimes unification could also cause warfare, right? So we use the temperature as a variation, and that turned out to be, that is a very good instrument, the deviation from the average temperature. And we can see the nomadic regimes were not affected, okay? So one thing that's quite important, nomadic regimes was on a very different institutions, not to mention ideologies, right? So it's a very mobile structure. They have very relatively little fixed investment in capital, and so the way they rule is very, very different. It's grazing land and so on. But most of nomadic regime, but one thing, of course, we all know they have military advantage because of the horses and also. We know that story very well. One of the, despite all the great story, we talk about Song dynasty, Yue Fei, and they are just not enough to, despite all the heroism, they don't know. I mean, part of the problem is Song never get proper horses, right? And they, there's trading of horses and so on, but it just didn't work very well. And they tried to have people raise horses, but it was very, very difficult. Okay, I just want to sort of conclude that hopefully we have a more comprehensive explanation. We go beyond a little bit just a geography argument, but we think geography is what started all of this. And I mean, not in this paper, like I was here maybe a month ago, I presented a paper on Japan. So one of the things, there's also interesting counterfactual test. Japan was a case that adopted Chinese ideology but never faced nomadic threat. You can see one of the things that's quite interesting is Japan remained a feudal structure. So Japan did not have the Junxianzi, did not have the Keju system. So that's a very interesting counter test in that regard. So I want to end by saying that in many ways, China on the edge of it is becoming what's called some kind of a cage. That's very important for absolutism to rise. So China was able to slowly expand the concept of 九州, right? So this is all under one heaven. And they were able to have centralized bureaucracy, certain repression, right? So by the Qing dynasty, censorship, the repression came very early. The Qing dynasty, 焚书坑儒, we all know that very, very well. So all that will work well when you have a closed system, right? So if you have multiple states like in Europe, that's very, very difficult to control. And if everybody's speaking language each other could understand, you control Germany, people ran to Italy and all of that. But in China, within one language, they are much better able to control. And the northern frontier was the only one that gave them trouble. That's why the Great Wall was there. And that's where eventually they achieved these agrarian nomadic synthesis and Chinese barbarian synthesis. That's very important. Huayi, they constantly shift the idea of Huayi, right? They accommodate a much larger state. And Chinese southern frontier was not an issue before. They were never challenged until the Opium War. And that's, of course, Chinese were beginning to redefine, because the first thing they call them, these Western imperials, is Yi, right? So if you remember the famous word by Wei Yuan, so all these things are, and that, of course, that same idea, same language was used by Japanese, used by later on by the Koreans to counter these are the new external enemies that we have. And so this particular ideology was extended beyond this. I should stop. Thank you very much.
Big fan. And I like this presentation. I really love the twists Professor Ma presents here. I love the discussion of John K. Fairbank and the fact that before his thesis of unity took hold, writing in the 80s, he felt that that Chinese terrain nurtured particularism and fragmentation, against the consensus, I think, of everybody. That was enlightening. I also loved hearing about how the Yongjung emperor really would have made an amazing historian. Right. He was able to historicize, to not fall into category errors that we do all the time, in terms of thinking about national boundaries when we shouldn't be thinking about national boundaries. Oftentimes in history, we think this is, of course, the very premise of Pomerantz's great work, not to think China, but to think particular regions. Not to think the West, but to think England, because ultimately it's not the West that industrializes, it's England that industrializes, and the rest of the West copies. And you can see the uneven development happen in real time. And in fact, this was a huge moneymaker for British people who are sending their train conductors to Germany and making big money, just like the Western pilots came over here to Hong Kong maybe in the 1980s and now are all millionaires, etc., right? Which is not a thing that happens anymore. Maybe John can tell us a little bit about it. I mean, I wish some people, like the Yongjung emperor, should have, some people are in the wrong business. I feel like maybe he would have been a better historian. I don't know, maybe he was a great emperor, frankly, I don't know. Maybe he did that well too. Now, I'm gonna do something a little bit unfair, if that's okay. Because I liked the whole argument about and you have that data, and it's great data about what produces unity within China, etc. But I guess what I want to do a little bit here is to question this binary of unity and fragmentation as the be-all of, it's a binary that grafts itself into an East-West as well, and it's the way that we explain something that may have other explanations. This you take for granted. It's been a long-standing debate, but I wonder if we should. And so I guess that's what I'm gonna question. My first question here then would be to ask, first of all, what you thought of yesterday's talk by Elizabeth, in which she calls for to not continuously use the West as the standard of Chinese historical development that is implicit in this issue of fragmentation and unity. If only China had been fragmented in the way the West was, then you might have seen new ideologies show up and new forms of governance and greater, and especially the dynamic, which is, again, I think we're grafting maybe a liberal understanding of what competition produces, that the dynamic of competition among states will then, would have then developed China into a much more sort of dynamic area. This, of course, is something that Elizabeth sort of tries to challenge a little bit in her work, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about it. She calls, very much like Pomerantz, for a Sinization of Western history, and not the other way around, right? To say, why didn't the West become like the Yangtze Delta, right? Like, maybe that's the strange part. It's not the other way around. But like, how is it that the West was able, or not the West, he never, that's the category error. Why is it that England in particular did it? Or did not develop like it should have? Because it's not just the Yangtze Delta, he sees other regions of the world developing in very similar ways, right? So he, it's 20 years before we've heard Elizabeth call for that kind of approach. Pomerantz was already putting that in question. Let me poke sides also on the Western side of the equation, and maybe there's slight little pokes, but again, Pomerantz here does not make unity or conflict the important factor that 200 years ago, and then there's also, I know there's a huge debate in the field, and I don't know half of it, and you know it all. But there's a huge debate in periodization about when things happen. He says 200 years, others say longer. But nevertheless, this idea that slavery really is the thing, that you have this, he calls it colonies, but what he means really is this enslaved people from which you can extract, incredible amounts of profit and value, because it's a one-way street for 200 years, right? It doesn't happen for a little bit, and that this is the thing that really develops the West. And he doesn't really, he doesn't really bring in Tilly or conflict or any of this stuff. Sven Beckert at Harvard has an interesting, and this is more modern history, but he's got an interesting article called American Danger, in which he documents 100 years of European thinking from the second half of the 19th century until 1950s or 60s, of thinking not that fragmentation is what's making them strong, but that unity and the continental territoriality matched to resources, it's what's making the US strong. And they're reacting to that strength. They see it coming even before America becomes the largest country in the world. It's a wonderful, and this is the kind of geopolitical thinking that's going on that lasts until very recently, with the Europeans uniting, also thinking about America. If we don't do this, it's going to be the McDonaldization of Europe, et cetera. So here we have then another view of strength, power and dynamism that's actually about territorial unity rather than fragmentation. And finally, at the end, you have a bit, you question whether the Confucian legalist synthesis that I guess may be still in effect, how it will do over the next 100 years or whatever. And I'm wondering, what is the use of a historical concept that describes a parallel of state formation and state capacity and state governance that lasts 2,000 years, right? I mean, this is, I guess, the synthesis happens at a particular moment. It really strengthens that maybe in the Middle Ages, but apparently it's still in effect. And I'm wondering if the comparison is valid. Is this not maybe too broad? Sorry.
Okay.
Oh, you know what?
Well, thanks very much, Oscar. Now, I will try to be brief, so as make sure we get enough time and so on. No, these are really wonderful questions, and let me have a quickly answer a question. First of all, can I comment a little bit on Yongzheng? And I only, for people in the field that know it for a long time, I mean, it was quite amazing to see Yongzheng was actually arguing against ethnic discrimination, basically. So you shouldn't be discriminating us. This is coming from someone who was the emperor, right? And of course, the most ironic thing that Yongzheng's debate with that prisoner was actually banned by Qianlong, who's his son, because it turned out that he was too rational and was not very good for a ruler to. And so all of this, so you see that very interesting dynamism that was coming out. I mean, it's bizarre somebody would be debating against a prisoner. I mean, the guy was locked up and, I mean, how can you ask him, do you agree with me? I mean, I just wondered, did he ever say no? So in the end, the prisoner gave a very, very passionate speech about how much he agreed with Yongzheng. So you don't know how much, but that's really quite the amusing part of it. I think, your point about this is, there is, so in the economic history profession, I won't be able to get into that in great lengths and so on. Sven Becker, global history, there's also the pioneer of the capitalism. Some of the economic historian, particularly mainstream economic historian, wanted to dismiss that very quickly. And in the China field, there's also, you probably know very well, people like Paul Cohen discovering history in China. In the history, there's postmodernism. So there are different, let me use my favorite word, ideologies that were coming into play here. And so I really appreciate the kind of question you're asking. I think we should be a lot more, inclusive in that sense, is looking at different perspective. I won't be able to answer all of that because that involves really going into different perspectives, different ways of thinking. Let me just say very, very quickly, the reason why I emphasize the whole 大一统, there is a, talk about Chinese way of thinking. Recently there's a book by Yang Yanqun I was talking to, and I think Mark Elliott was one of the discussants of it. It's about the 天命的转移, and it was a very interesting discussion. So I'm quite admired that Yang Yanqun was actually raising that question. The reason he was raising that, he wanted to show how this idea of 大一统 was so important to China today, particularly in the 20th century, especially in the Republican period when Qing fell. The idea of ethnicity became a very, very serious issue. And then the fact that China could be carved up. And China was at the same time going through a parliament, a liberal democracy, and all of that. And then it was facing the risk of Mongolian being taken away, Tibetan being threatened, and all these things. So these things are very relevant in that regard. And of course, we know these issues are very relevant today. So I think there's that particular angle that I want to sort of get into that. I completely agree with you about this whole binary. I think the issue, you have, so the traditional economic historian would talk about there is this whole rise of the West. There's the Western exceptionalism. I mean, the greatest example, someone I greatly admire, we probably all admire, is John Mercure, talking about enlightenment and scientific achievements. Those things are definitely true. And certainly there is also exploitation that came with it, with colonization. But now they are certainly something morally to be condemned. But one of the things I want to argue is very interesting in the case of China. The 大一统 had a certain impact. One of the things that banned people from going abroad. The greatest example is China, is Japan. Before Meiji, late Tokugawa, they began to allow people. So even if China knows there's a new world there, they wouldn't go exploit them, which may be good for the world. but there is that really generate very different dynamics. Maybe if we go beyond this whole ideology, we want to say that this is something that has a real consequence to that. And I agree that, let me probably end in that way, especially when I was talking about Japan. I'm not trying to argue that if China was fragmented, then it will become like Europe. There are many places that are fragmented. It was not going anywhere. Behind the European fragmentation, there are all kinds of, ways that we did not expect. For example, we talked about the idea of cooperation, right? That was very important. Certainly, I think Ziwu has written about it, is the Christian religion, which is connected with the cooperation, which will also very accidentally connect with the rise of science. So there's a lot of accidental elements in the European element, and that combined with fragmentation, that led to see what we see as the rise of the West. And to a certain degree, maybe the West was exceptional in the sense that it was really very strange. China was more normal in that regard. So I should really stop.